Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's November 13, 2020 program, Fire on the River, before, during, and after the Holiday Farm Fire. This is the 10th program of our 2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofueugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and are rebroadcast on public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 on Mondays at 7 p.m. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, UO has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. We would also like to acknowledge the generous support we received from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. On to today's program. On the night of September 7th, the Holiday Farm Fire ignited near milepost 47 on Oregon Highway 126 along the banks of the McKenzie River. By September 9th, the U.S. Forest Service Incident Command reported, quote, "Red flag conditions have caused explosive fire growth over the past 2 days on the Holiday Farm Fire. Firefighters have been constantly moving as they conduct rescue operations and try to hold the fire when it's possible. The region, the state, and the entire West Coast have been heavily impacted by fires. Resources are scarce at this time," end quote. Over the ensuing hours and days, the Holiday Farm Fire would consume more than 173,000 acres of the Mackenzie River Valley, level hundreds of homes, and displace valley residents across multiple communities. In the face of such extraordinary circumstances, in such an extraordinary river valley, local community organizations and individuals rallied to the cause. This program, the first of 2 City Club programs on the Holiday Farm Fire, is focused on the inspired community response and extraordinary natural context of the Mackenzie River itself. I would like to thank Karin Knutson, a member of the City Club's Program Committee, for coordinating today's program and for serving as moderator. Today's speakers include Joe Mall, Gordon Grant, and Jared Pruch. Joe Mall of the Mackenzie River Trust will share his organization's close relationship with the river landscape and explain how that familiarity allowed the trust to pivot from land conservation to emergency response assistance at the height of the widespread evacuation. Joe has been the executive director of the Mackenzie River Trust for 15 years. He began working with the trust in January 2005 after working mostly with grizzly bears and landowners in Montana and Hokkaido, Japan during the preceding 2 decades. His undergraduate degree is in economics, and he holds a master's degree from the University of Montana, Missoula's School of Forestry. Outside of his work with the Trust, he likes to spend as much time as he can running trails and exploring the outdoors with his wife and 3 boys. Gordon Grant of the U.S. Forest Service will share the deeper history of the McKenzie River itself, the unique hydrogeomorphology of this watershed, and insights to how this landscape weathers crises. Gordon is a research hydrologist for the U.S. Forest Service and a courtesy professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University and a BA from the Clark Honors College at the University of Oregon. Over the past 35 years, his research has focused on understanding the geomorphic response of rivers to changes in stream flow and sediment transport due to land use, dams, and dam removal, volcanic eruptions, and climate change. Jared Pruch, Director of Community Impact at United Way of Lane County, will share how an outpouring of community support is helping to meet emergency needs. The United Way's Wildfire Response Fund has already invested nearly $475,000 in local recovery and response efforts. Jared Pruch has been the Director of Community Impact at United Way of Lane County since 2017. He is responsible for directing United Way's community investment grant making and providing leadership and support to United Way's community impact efforts, including the Wildfire Response Fund. Before joining the United Way, Jared spent several years supporting grassroots, community-driven projects for Cascade Pacific Resource and Conservation and Development and earned degrees from Colorado College and the University of Oregon. Thank you, and now I will turn it over to Karin Knudsen.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, City Club listeners, for joining us today. As Scott mentioned, this is the first of 2 programs on the Holiday Farm Fire and Community Recovery. And before we begin, I want to offer just a brief warning that today's program will include descriptions of events that were quite destructive in our community and certainly are associated with grief that many people are still experiencing. So just a warning to listeners that some of our discussion today certainly has emotional components to it, and we want you to be thinking about that as you prepare to join us. And with that, I will hand it off to Joe Moll of McKenzie River Trust.
Thanks, Karin. I'm Joe Moll. I'm the Executive Director of McKenzie River Trust, and certainly no expert on the river or this fire. There are a great many people who have been out on the ground for the last 2 months, even as we meet today, working to both understand and address what's happened. So I think my opportunity today is just to give you a few thoughts on what we've experienced and what we're thinking. And as City Club has often done, give us a chance to consider how we move forward with some of these challenges and opportunities that may be behind them. So in the days that followed the outbreak of the Holiday Farm Fire, many of us downstream could only imagine what was happening upstream. The official reports were limited, aerial photos were nearly impossible to get because of prevailing winds and smoke. And the stories we heard in phone calls or read in the news or online were so shocking and surreal that it was hard to grasp. I remember stepping outside to water our garden. Given my work with the Trust, I've developed a habit of recognizing the McKenzie River wherever I find it. In this case, it was right there, coming out of the hose and showering a few plants. I was used to that association, but now the tomatoes and the lettuce and the strawberry leaves were coated in thick ash from a fire that was from that same place. I was now pouring the McKenzie River back onto its forests right there in my garden. For someone miles downstream whose life and home and neighborhood was fully intact, That realization was one of the first times I began to get even a hint about the scale of what had really happened. David Perry of Vida lost his life. Hundreds of people lost homes, businesses, all their goods, many memories. All of us lost whatever self-assurance we had that things like that fire could really only happen somewhere else. So what did happen? What really happened? And how do we make sense of it? We think we understand how the world works around here, and this kind of a disaster really tests us. The Mackenzie is on fire. The town of Blue River is gone. That's how it was described for me that morning of September 8th. And it made me think of two things to highlight. First, the river itself is so much of how we define that much larger geography. The thought of a fire on a river, like the Cuyahoga in Ohio in 1969 and many times before that, that doesn't make sense around here. The forests and homes and communities in the footprint of the Holiday Farm fire certainly burned, but our minds still associate that whole valley with the McKenzie River. I think there are a lot of people who kept pulling that name even from the Holiday Farm to just the McKenzie fire. The river is a powerful force, not just for the goods and services it provides. It's a powerful draw on our hearts. It's a touchstone, a point of reference. It is home ground. And the thought that it was on fire added another layer of pain to the loss of life and the loss of whatever levels of security and wealth and memory that residents and the rest of us felt. But the river is still there. The second thing to consider is that sense that somehow the town of Blue River is gone. Totally understandable at the time. People fled the fire during an inferno. They were already seeing things burn to the ground. Embers, some as big as your hand, were flying horizontal in that east wind. There seemed to be no way that any structure would survive. After the fire raced through and the smoke started to clear, it was apparent that many had been consumed, but not all, and certainly not the town's sense of itself as a community. Battered though the people of Blue River and Nimrod and Vida and Leeburg have been by this fire, they have remained connected and positive and creative. They even found some solace in humor while things still smoldered. Some remarked tongue-in-cheek that they realize now that they just need to rebuild with bricks and river rocks because their chimneys still stood while everything else had burned. I've only been upriver twice since that fire, and both times I experienced a disorientation that many had warned me about. Where am I? Many of the points of reference are missing. Houses, vehicles, signs, businesses, groves of trees, the waypoints for how we make our way upstream and downstream, fallen down, twisted beyond recognition, some simply gone. Even standing along the banks of the river above Finn Rock or in the forests nearby is unsettling. It's disorienting for me. On the ground, it's like a great uncovering has occurred. Those mountains of blackberry at the old Roseboro ponds, well, with the blackberry burned off, now we see clean piles of gravel. The young forest on the flats of Riverbank left, with its thick ferns and understory bramble burned away, the forest floor is revealed to be dotted with piles of cans and bottles discarded by the people living there over the last 70 years. This fire has uncovered some history, how we've used the land in this river for the last century. Those huge cottonwoods that towered above us on walks across the old cross-country course between Elk Creek and the Mackenzie, their deep blankets of moss seemingly evaporated, and many are now laid down on the ground, generally in a downriver direction, toppled by that wind. The wind-driven fire baked the forested hillsides. In many places, dug fir held on to scorched needles. Even pockets of hardwood held on to some of their leaves, crisp though they were. Over the last 2 months, those needles and leaves have fallen and are helping to cover the ground. That will help temper the potential erosion that will come with rain and melting snow. At the same time, as that canopy either burned away or is now fallen away, the underlying landforms are uncovered. You can better see, for example, why those forested floodplains are so productive and produce those giant cottonwoods in there. Or back in the day, the fir and cedar stumps, whose stumps remain from the early 20th century harvests. The soil in there is deep, a gift from the river during high water. At the same time, when you move up the hillsides, you can see so much clearly how thin the soils are in some places, how much rock is upslope, and how it has broken off over time, but to be held in place by trees that grew there, many now standing dead. And some of those slopes are right above Highway 126, and in places, some of our houses and home sites are right below them. Even driving that highway, another thing that has been uncovered is just how close we are to the river, not just in our hearts and minds, but in physical distance. As hazard trees have been taken down, especially the river, and the limited buffer between our lives and the river is now quite visible. The health of that water is a community asset whose value appreciates more by the day. Those of us downstream looking upstream need to consider that buffer and how we can encourage and support good stewardship of such a valuable community treasure. We have another treasure upriver, thankfully, a place that has given us a framework for trying to understand big changes like this in the forest and streams and the McKenzie River. Right there past Blue River, you have the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, a long-term ecological research site, a place to learn about the forest, the land, and the water. For I think 70 plus years, they've been methodical in their observations and asking, what happened here? Whether it's the slow decay of a downed log over 100 years or more, or the range and number of fish, and reptiles, and aquatic insects using different parts of a stream, or the growth of trees following different silvicultural treatments, or how landslides happen in different places at different times. Quietly, day after day, year after year, researchers there are watching, noting things, coming up with questions, testing assumptions, as science is designed to do, all to help us better understand what just happened, what's happening now, what might happen in the future. At HJ since 2003, there's also been a long-term ecological reflections project, in which artists and writers and thinkers look at that connection between our hearts and places like the McKenzie River, between our souls and a towering hemlock or the smallest of salamanders. They too ask those questions. What happened? What's happening here now? What might happen in the future? So perhaps the most important thing that this experience and the framework that places like HJ and science and the humanities in general can help us uncover is how hard we cling to our assumptions. We're pretty good at assuming we know what's going on and what will come and how to handle it. We have a difficult time pausing just to witness something that has happened before immediately assuming we know cause and effect. We have a long road ahead of us, and we will do really well to be patient with each other, to learn from each other, and perhaps press pause on what we assume we know about what happened and how best to respond. So I know that Gordon will have a few thoughts about this, and I don't want to assume too much about what you have to say, but I'll pass the microphone now to Gordon Grant.
Thank you, Joe, for that really eloquent picture that you've painted of the river and what has happened. I'm Gordon Grant. I'm a research hydrologist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm also a courtesy professor of geosciences at Oregon State University. The Mackenzie River has been part of my life for over half a century, ever since I moved out to Eugene in the mid-60s. My first river fishing trip, my first real view of whitewater rapids, my early years as a river guide, my graduate school dissertation, and a primary focus of almost 40 years of research, and now as a grateful owner of a river cabin that thankfully survived the fire, even as I acknowledge all the people whose homes were lost. In all that time, the Mackenzie and its tributaries have been my home waters. I've spent the last 35 years of my life working as a hydrologist and geomorphologist for the research branch of the Forest Service. It's been my privilege to spend my adult life studying rivers and their form and their behavior from around the world. And from that experience, I can state unequivocally that the Mackenzie River is one of the most unusual and unique rivers on planet Earth. Every river is unique in some ways, but some are more unique than others, and the Mackenzie is one of the most special. This uniqueness stems in large part from having its headwaters in an active range of young volcanoes that receive 9 to 10 feet of precipitation in an average year. Many of the things we love most about the river, the color and clarity of its water, its persistence through the dry Oregon summer, the cold temperatures that sustain an incredibly productive fisheries, aquatic habitat, and many other features come from this geological setting. I don't have the time today to really do this geological story justice. Perhaps I can come back at some future point and share it with you. But instead, I want to talk about the fires, their historical context, their consequences, and what we might expect in the future. While the geological template that was the stage on which the fires took place, it wasn't a big factor in what happened, although it may influence what will happen down the road. As a geologist, I spend a lot of time thinking about time, and there are a lot of telescoping timescales embedded within the fire event, starting with the minutes, hours, days, and weeks over which the fire burned, and which Joe characterized so beautifully, followed now by the months and likely years of recovery and restoration, and ultimately the decades and centuries over which a new forest will grow and mature. But there are also the timescales of centuries and millennia over which fires like this one have occurred, and these are useful for thinking about the present fires. And there are also events lasting days, weeks, and years to come over which some of the consequences of the fire are likely to be felt. Concerning the fire history, we know that fire has always been a part of the Oregon landscape. The indigenous people who lived here long before the Europeans came to settle it probably lived with very smoky summers. From interpreting fire history as preserved in fire scars and tree rings in our older forests, we know that fires came in different flavors and different places had different fire regimes. For the wet west side forests, in general, there were two main types of fires, relatively frequent, say 80 to 100-year return period in any one place, fires that burned small to moderate sized patches. And then rare, say every 300 to 500-year, massive fires that burned very large areas. This past summer was of the latter category. Most likely these massive fires were the result of a very similar weather pattern and driven by very strong eastern winds after extended dry periods. The historical record is too fuzzy to interpret whether it's similar patterns of fire rolling out of and down through the western river valleys prevailed, but it's likely. So what we've just experienced is a rare event at the human time scale, though not an unusual event at the century to millennial time scale. In the same way that fire regimes are different in different places, fires do different things in different places as well. Right now, there's a lot of concern about what the implications of all this burned steep ground is likely to be for in the coming winters when we get our big storms. This concern typically focuses on issues such as flooding, landslides, and debris flows. For many people, the images that come to mind are what typically happens in Southern California and the Southwest after fire, where fire is followed by floods and destructive debris flows. This is of concern in this region, although there are a number of reasons why this is less likely to occur here, and these are factors including that involve climate, geology, and vegetation. Our storms here are typically less intense. The water that falls and the snow that melts rapidly infiltrate our forest soils, and fires typically do not result in widespread impervious layers, which goes by the mouthful word hydrophobicity. And all of this means that increased flooding and accompanying debris flows are likely to be less common here than, say, in Southern California. What is more worrisome is the potential for landsliding and debris flows. And this is likely to be a concern over the next 5 to 10 years as the root systems that these trees supported decay and hill slopes become increasingly unstable. Another concern that I would expect to see manifest itself most likely starting this winter, but certainly occurring over the next decade or so, is that we're going to see a lot of that burned wood ending up in the river itself. So the first people down the river in each river season are going to have to take extra precautions to be aware that a river that they know oh so well is likely to be choked in some places by burned debris. So these are likely to be some of the initial manifestations of the fire. Certainly, if we were to get a large storm in here of the kind that happened in 1996, then all kinds of mischief becomes possible, and all bets are off. But it is my expectation that we're going to see, at least in the coming winter or two, certainly muddy water, certainly ash washing off the hills, certainly trees falling in, but unlikely to see the massive scale of destruction that we see following following fires in Southern California. Over time, the landscape will change, and change is a fundamental property of the landscapes, of all landscapes that in this place. This is going to be both full of surprises that we don't expect, but also there will be a certain, I believe, comfort and satisfaction as new growth becomes apparent, as new trees take root, as the forest cover, as the moss that Joe spoke about, reestablishes itself, as the mushrooms grow and carpet the slopes. And I would expect to see that in the next, by 100 years from now, the people who drive up the river, as we all do, will see a very, in some ways, familiar landscape, even as it has changed from what we have known so well from the past. So I'd now like to turn this over to Jaron Pruch, who will give us a deeper sense of what the human response to this event has been. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon and Joe and Karin. I'm Jared Pruch, Director of Community Impact at United Way of Lane County. And I'm going to speak to how United Way, with the support of community donations, has been trying to support responses to the human impacts of the Holiday Farm fire, and share a few specific stories of how we've seen community organizations and volunteers coming together to respond to needs. United Way has a strong focus on education and health, particularly for children and youth, as well as a guiding emphasis on equity, which to us means identifying and working to address disparities that community members in Lane County face because of race, geography, and income. And one of the ways that we do our work is by raising funds to invest in community-based organizations that are providing services to vulnerable families and individuals. There are other ways that we've been involved in the Holiday Farm fire through our volunteer coordination work and participation in our local COAD, which stands for Community Organizations Active in Disaster. But I'm going to primarily talk about our involvement through our Wildfire Response Fund and the efforts we've been able to support with community donations. As Joe said, many of us woke up on September 8th to a new reality, experiencing something we haven't experienced before as a community and something that we never thought could happen. That morning, we started hearing those just heartbreaking stories about people having to flee RV parks with just the clothes on their backs. Firefighters losing their homes while they were fighting the fire. Real concerns about how far the fire was going to spread. Was the fire going to come down to Marcola or into Thurston? We didn't know, but the severity of the human impact of the fire, along with the environmental impacts that have been discussed, was immediately evident. We now know that the fire destroyed over 800 structures, including at least 460 residential structures, and 30 commercial buildings. So on the Wednesday morning after the fire started, we launched a wildfire response fund at United Way. And it's worth noting that we did that in partnership with the McKenzie River Trust. Our two organizations haven't had a formal relationship in the past, but our shared interest in supporting these rural communities and the people that live there brought us together in this event. And when we launched the fund, the community showed up really quickly to provide financial support. We had thousands of new donors in a matter of a week, and phones were ringing off the hook at our office. In the first week, community members donated over $400,000 to the Wildfire Response Fund from donors right here in Lane County and also from around the country. So I want to really pause and thank everyone, probably many of the listeners of this program who contributed to this fund, as well as other wildfire response efforts. We've now invested over $500,000 in services related to the human impacts of the fire, and we will continue investing as critical needs emerge over time. We recognized early on that there were going to be a few stages of this disaster, as with any disaster: an immediate response and relief stage, and a midterm to long-term recovery stage. And that it was going to be important to be thoughtful about what community needs would arise and be most critical over time. So one of the things we did the first week was to reach out to other communities that have lived through severe fire events. Some of our fellow United Ways in Northern California that lived through the Camp Fire that destroyed the Paradise community, the Car Fire that burned neighborhoods in Redding. Those felt like faraway events that all of a sudden were here on our doorstep. And there were a couple big takeaways we had from those conversations. And one of them was how long the recovery process is going to take. We are really just crossing the starting line right now. And number two, how quickly a disaster like this is likely to fade from public attention, despite the fact that the needs will be persistent and long-term. We know, for example, that when a disaster hits, donations typically peak 4 to 6 weeks after the event, and by 6 months after the event, they've typically zeroed out, even though some of the most urgent community needs, human needs, won't be presenting themselves until 6 months or a year after a disaster. So in that initial response and relief stage during the first few weeks after the fire began, there were a large number of residents of the Mackenzie Valley displaced into Eugene and Springfield. And for those community members, we were really seeing the need for basic services like emergency food and shelter. We saw food trucks popping up to feed fire survivors, faith-based groups stepping up to provide lodging. People needed access to crisis counseling. People needed things as simple as having a place to take a shower, childcare services for families that were under tremendous strain, and getting highly vulnerable like seniors and foster families, people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities connected to services. Just basic needs that any of us would experience if we were suddenly displaced from our home and maybe didn't have as much financial stability as we would like. And it's worth noting here that many residents of the Mackenzie Valley were struggling before the fire. It's a rural area that faces many of the barriers that exist in other rural areas of Lane County. Transportation barriers, lack of jobs, lack of affordable housing, challenges around access to high quality childcare. So when disasters hit, whether it's COVID or a wildfire, we know those disaster events will hit hardest for people already facing the greatest disparities. Families navigating poverty, people of color, people who don't have a permanent address or a stable place to live. During the initial stage, we were also really trying to get a sense of what other resources like Red Cross and FEMA were going to be available to help people out so there wasn't a duplication of services. I'm representing United Way, but I want to really acknowledge the many other organizations and individuals that stepped up in significant ways during the fire. Lane County Emergency Management, the Red Cross, the community volunteers over at Silky Field, faith-based organizations, really just too many to list. We have a lot to learn that we need to learn collectively from this event because there will be another disaster. It's not a question of if, but when. But we also have a lot of assets that show up in disaster. So on the one hand, we were trying to understand critical needs in the urban area where displaced residents were in temporary housing, but also consider the needs in the Mackenzie Valley, particularly in Blue River, the areas and communities most affected by the fires. Because our United Way has established relationships with nonprofit organizations in the Mackenzie, we were hearing firsthand the kinds of critical needs that were emerging upriver in those first few weeks. Things like a generator for a church that was serving as a community hub in Mackenzie Bridge, hot meals for first responders and community members in Rainbow, support for the Mackenzie Valley residents that had been displaced over to Deschutes County. They evacuated to the east rather than to the west, and support for the Blue River Health Clinic, which was burned in the fire, so they could make the pivot to providing telehealth services and staying connected to their clients. We really saw the McKenzie River communities demonstrate tremendous resilience and adaptation when the disaster hit. Community organizations started hosting regular coordination calls. There were organizations rethinking how they could use their existing assets to support community needs. One example of that is the Mackenzie Community Track and Field. They thought maybe we could have the track serve as a spot for families whose kids are enrolled in the school to park RVs over the winter so that the kids can stay connected to school. And the last story I want to share about community organizations in the Mackenzie responding to the fire kind of exemplifies the pivot moment that we're in right now, moving from immediate relief and response and beginning to look at an interim recovery stage. People may have seen this story in the news. There are a series of relief centers in the Mackenzie, Blue River Relief Center, the Rainbow Relief Center, and the Vida Relief Center for community members to access emergency food, water, and donated goods and other services. And these relief centers were organized by community volunteers, just neighbors helping neighbors. In some cases, people who have lost their homes or their income are there volunteering because they want to help each other out. One of the goals is to provide a location where community members can access services over the winter, particularly if there is a weather event like a flood or an ice storm that isolates these communities. So the relief centers to me are evidence that the Mackenzie communities and the people that live there are already thinking about mitigation and preparedness, which is where every disaster cycle begins and ends. It's a huge testament to these communities that they've brought this effort together in a time of tremendous crisis and stress. So here we are about 2 months past when the fire started, and we know this is just the very beginning of a long process of recovery to a new normal. But I want to just end on a bit of a hopeful note. Not to diminish in any way the trauma that the survivors of the fire have lived through, or the significance of the loss and the significance of the process of recovery, but one of the themes that I'm really hearing and seeing from community members in the Mackenzie is hope. People being really thoughtful and creative about the possibilities that exist when we go through a disruptive crisis like this. We're seeing community organizations and volunteers coming together in new ways to think about what they want their community to look like in the long term, to build upon the unique identity and the unique assets of this valley that so many of us cherish. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared Pruch and Gordon Grant and Joe Mole, for your remarks and for helping us to better understand the context of the Holiday Farm fire and also this extraordinary valley and river that we all live as a part of. We have a lot that we could follow up in discussion today and have some questions that have come in from other members of the City Club Programming Committee, and certainly a lot that your remarks raised. I want to begin by asking just a few specific questions. Joe Mole from McKenzie River Trust, you mentioned the network of partners that the Trust works with upriver, and I'd wondering if you could share a little bit more about the restoration projects that McKenzie River Trust and partners had been working on before this fire, and then the impacts of the fire on those efforts.
Sure. I mentioned at the beginning that there are a lot of people on the ground, even today, have been for months. Staff at the McKenzie River Trust, the Mackenzie Watershed Council, the Upper Willamette Soil and Water Conservation District, EWEB, U.S. Forest Service. People often say the Mackenzie River Trust does great things, and these are the members that constitute the trust. They are the trust. We're all collectively the trust. And in terms of knowing what's going on in the watershed, and especially with changes in the river, sometimes active with restoration, we have just a really deep bench in the area. And so you look at places like the South Fork, just below Cooper Dam, where it burned pretty hot in some places. The Delta Campground area that many people know well was dramatically changed. Some of the efforts to broaden the floodplain there and bring back more large wood and slow the water down and spread it out, we were all very concerned that work that had been done over the last several years may have been for naught. In fact, we found in that area the restoration projects themselves lost less than 1% of the wood that had been placed in there. And when they went in to look at both at that site, and when we went to look at a property that we own at Finrock Reach, where we're starting restoration in stream there, the salmon were there spawning right in the midst of the fire. Very quickly, people started to look at research, some very recent, that shows that wetted areas where beaver dominate, for example, tend to weather fires comparatively well. It makes a lot of sense. You've brought the water table up, you've broadened it out. And hardwoods are more fire resistant generally than conifers. So I think the efforts that have happened to date will only get more of a boost, because we're seeing that it really does make sense to us, not just ecologically, but economically, because this is such a valuable water resource for those of us downstream, that anything that we can do to really buffer the system to all sorts of potential changes, it's money well spent.
Mm-hmm. Building on that thought, Gordon Grant, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about the connection between what Joe just mentioned and this river and its sort of wetted areas and that longer geological history that you alluded to. We certainly don't have time for the whole of the Mackenzie River's geological history today, but just a little more to help our listeners and members understand what makes this place so special.
Right. I only have 50 million years to go. Glad that you asked that question. So what really distinguishes the Mackenzie is the fact that it's a river that drains a young active volcanic zone. And there have been volcanoes here literally for the last, let's say at least the last 40 million years. But the real character of the river is a direct consequence of the fact that the headwaters that are getting all that water that comes off the Pacific Ocean like clockwork every year, all that water is falling on layers upon layers upon layers of lava flows that dominate the high Cascades. Most people think of the high Cascades for the Three Sisters, the big charismatic volcanoes sitting on the horizon, but most of it, at least in the Mackenzie area, are broad expanses of just layered lava flows, one on top of the other, like a giant sandwich. The sandwich has lots of holes in it, lots of fractures, and lots of cracks. So when all that rain coming off the Pacific falls on it, the water, instead of running off, runs down into the ground. It's like a giant geological sponge. And that water reemerges in these giant cold water springs, some of which aren't even on the map, but which sustain the river and, by extension, the entire Willamette system throughout the long, dry Oregon summer. So in a sense, the Mackenzie is two rivers for the price of one. You have that headwater reach, as I've just described it, and then as you get further on downstream, you get the tributaries coming in: Blue River, the South Fork, Gate Creek, Quartz Creek, and such. And these have a very different character. They have very rapid runoff patterns. They have very little storage of water in the ground. So you have an upstream reach that is a sponge, that is full of water, that releases water over time. The volumes of water in that sponge are really almost mind-boggling. They are on the scale of large continental lakes, like Salt Lake, or reservoirs like Mead, stored in the rock, in the fractures in the rock. And that is why the river is there in the summertime. That is why it's cold. That is why you can still navigate a boat down it even in August. And that's all coming out of that deep groundwater system. And that's a very unusual setup. I know of very few other places in the world, maybe in Iceland, maybe in Japan, where you find similar constellations of geographies that produce that kind of thing. But the Mackenzie's a very unusual place.
We live in a fascinating place. That makes me also wonder about a point that you and Joe raised earlier, I believe, around comparisons of this fire and this event to other places, and because of those strong east winds, and I think the recognizable pattern that most people see as familiar to Southern California, and that I think the Santa Ana winds fanning their fire disasters. Could you say more about how we can understand this to be different from those examples? Because there has been a lot of discussion about how parallel this is to those disasters and what we might need to be worried about with regards to flooding and erosion and landslides in this coming winter or winters.
Well, I spoke a little bit about that before, but in the context of the fires themselves, I mean, what we've seen over the last 10, 20 years is this enormous increase in the frequency and the magnitude, the severity of these Western fires. And many of them have the same character to them. That is, they are, once an ignition occurs, the wind just runs with them. And that's certainly what we saw in the case of the Holiday Farm fire. It was a wind-driven event, and that's really where the big events happen. So that seems to be similar up and down the West Coast. What is different here is that, the nature of the forest itself is different. We have a forest, in contrast to, say, Southern California, which has a lot of chaparral, which has a lot of very fire-prone vegetation close to the ground. The trees are further, more dispersed. That's a landscape that burns very hot rather frequently. Our landscape tends to burn hot when it burns, but less frequently, and because in large measure because it's wetter. And Joe already sort of spoke to some of the features of the geography that make it wetter. The other distinction is the one I talked about, having to do with what's likely to happen next. And that is because we have these deep forest soils where the speed with which water can infiltrate the soil is typically faster than even our larger rainstorms around here. That's not true in Southern California, but it is true here. And so what that means is, instead of running off over the surface, the water goes into the ground, even in places that don't have that geological sponge, as I alluded to before. So the water is going down, and therefore it's being mediated. And that isn't being changed by the fires to the same degree as it is in Southern California, where you get large areas that essentially become impermeable after fire because of the nature of the burning, because of the nature of the vegetation. There's a lot of waxes in it. The soil becomes impervious. Here, there may be local places of it, but it's not a common phenomenon. And so in that sense, we're lucky. If the place that we have to be cautious, however, is the fact that our steep landscapes are in many cases held together by tree roots. The trees play an outsized role in just creating stability. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the root systems are going to decompose. And as that occurs, the stability of those slopes will decrease. And so the window of landsliding is likely to be longer here than it will be in Southern California. But those other processes are less likely to occur.
Thank you. Speaking of comparisons and what we can learn from looking at other places and their recovery experience, Jared, I want to turn to you for a moment and ask if you might share a little bit more about what the United Way has learned from other communities that have dealt with fires of the magnitude of this one and in contexts like this one. And what are some of the things that we need to be watching out for as community members in terms of how we're thinking of this disaster, or what might be helpful or not helpful? Tell us some about what you all have learned.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the big things we've learned is just how long the process of recovery takes. So as an example, we know for some communities that have survived fires, 5 years later, they might be lucky to be at a 15 to 20% rate of structures being rebuilt. So that would be, you lose 100 structures, 5 years on, maybe you've rebuilt 15 to 20 of those. So the time scale is part of it. Right now, there's an organization based in the McKenzie called the McKenzie Community Development Corporation that's really been playing kind of a backbone role, coordinating some of the service providers up there. And they're taking the lead on the formation of what's called a long-term recovery group. And that's sort of a national best practice that's supported by FEMA. And it's basically, a coalition of the willing. It's faith-based organizations, nonprofit, government sector, community volunteers who want to really come together under a big tent to look at unmet needs over time, everything from emotional and spiritual care to disaster case management for families to construction management. People navigate all the systems they're going to need to navigate. So we're very early in that, but that's one of the efforts that'll be ongoing over time. And in terms of what we should be thinking about in terms of our broader community, I think we need to be really thinking about that stage of mitigation and preparedness for disasters versus relief and response, because we know that for every dollar that we spend on mitigation and preparedness, we get a return on investment of 6 to 1. So $6 back for every dollar we spend on mitigation and preparedness. So that's something that we can all play a role in, from personal preparedness to organizational preparedness to finding ways to be in coordination when the next disaster comes.
You mentioned the United Way's partnership with so many local organizations and nonprofits who provide services and support services within the community that really stepped up and reoriented their missions to this disaster. Could you tell us more about those partnerships and how some of that service delivery is happening within the community?
Sure, I would love to. And so we've provided over 40 grants at this time in the last 2 months, but I'd love to shine a light on a couple specific examples. And one of them is the Northwest Youth Corps. And the Northwest Youth Corps is based here in Eugene. And given the scale of the fires this season, and that's something for people to remember as well, is we're talking about the Holiday Farm fire here, but this was one of many fires in the state of Oregon and throughout the West Coast that national disaster organizations like the Red Cross were trying to respond to. The scale of the wildfires this year was really, I think, unprecedented, at least in a lot of our time scales that we think of on the human level rather than the geologic level that Gordon has been talking about. But I do want to mention the Northwest Youth Corps. So they had these groups of young people that had signed up to do a year of service, and they had a lot of their crews kind of on pause because of the fires. They couldn't go out and do the projects that they were signed up to do. So Northwest Youth Corps reached out to us at United Way and said, hey, can we redirect some of these crews to come down into the Mackenzie? And, you know, are there things they can do? They know how to use chainsaws. They can, you know, clean debris out of driveways and that type of thing. So they really stepped up. They were played a big role in preparing the VITA Relief Center, which is located at Leeburg Lake at the McKenzie River Discovery Center. Another one is the Upper Mackenzie Community Center, which is up in Rainbow. If people might know where Blue Sky Market is, and the Upper Mackenzie Community Center is back there behind the market. And they are another organization that really just stepped up and they said, hey, we've got a building, we can provide services here. And that's a place where they're calling it a free store now. People can come in and get what they need. There's really just a lot of examples like that that I could mention, including some of the social service agencies that are located in Eugene and Springfield, but they really provide services countywide. So the ARC is an example of that. Oregon Community Programs, Direction Service, really needed to work with families that have kids with special needs, who were displaced by the fire and really experiencing a lot of challenges and trauma. So, you know, we have a really rich nonprofit sector in Lane County, and everyone has been trying to play a role. Green Hill Humane Society is one of the organizations we partnered with. They've been providing tremendous services for people, and we know how valuable pets are for us and just mitigating some of the trauma that people experience in disasters.
Mm. Such great examples of the way that this community has come together to support each other and the people who've been impacted most severely by this fire. We have just a couple of minutes left, and so I want to be sure to ask you all one kind of big picture closing question, and you know, with an eye towards a second City Club program in January, where we'll ask the question what it means to rebuild in this place. You know, think about the year of 2020, and for a lot of people, it's been a quite disrupted experience, a time certainly of significant disruption. And in you know, using that term, really referencing the experience of having, you know, a typical pattern of life and a typical series of events be changed significantly, and not in an expected way. In the case of this disaster and this wildfire, Holiday Farm, you know, characterizing it as a disruption, you know, situates this fire as something that may only happen once every 300 to 500 years, but that is a part of a more, you know, predictably disruptive experience. And I'm just wondering if the three of you could offer us your thoughts, you know, what we can learn about dealing with these kinds of disturbances that are likely to be continuing, when also, you know, dealing at a global scale with disruptive pandemics like COVID-19. How can we better manage these types of challenges when they are nested within other challenges?
That's a big question, Karen.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really big question. I'll take make a quick comment about it. I think that Jared referred to the fact that many of the communities in the upriver Mackenzie Valley have been struggling economically, And I know that even self-determination and definition of where one community begins and another ends. And so for a long time, they've talked about it being a 52-mile long community, which has some interesting cachet, but it's also pretty challenging, quite frankly. I think going forward for this place and us now going forward, the more that we can recognize that whether we live here in Springfield, in Eugene, anywhere downstream, even down to Portland, as Gordon noted, the connections to that upstream area and all of the people that are the stewards of those places that care for them, that we would do well to think of all of us being really connected at a community level, because we have a vested interest in what goes on far upstream, all the way down to where we are, simply in the health of that water. And I think from an emergency response perspective, every winter when we consider what could happen with a flood, as well as the development that can occur over the course of the year, feeling like that we're all a part of this McKenzie River community will help us address some of those complexities in the long run.
So the year 2020 has been a crash course in resilience for all of us. And as we are confronted with the need to, as we confront the experience of change, both individually and in our families and in our communities, I think what events like the fire do is they summon up our deeper capacities to not just make sense of the world, but to, in a sense, keep moving forward in the world. And I don't have any particular great insight about how to do that, other than I think we've all experienced it. And so the lessons are in some ways embedded in the way we look back and the way we will tell the stories of our experience of this year and beyond.
I'll just add quickly that I think as we begin to think about recovery and rebuilding, the more that we can do that with a lens around the community members that face the greatest disparities and designing solutions that work for them, those solutions are also going to work for the rest of us and improve community conditions across the board.
This has been our November 13th, 2020 program, Fire on the River, before, during, and after the holiday farm fire. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize some gold sponsors: Network Charter School, Sacred Earth Botanicals, and Luvas Cobb, and Summit Bank. Support for the City Club comes from Summit Bank, your local community bank. An independent community bank headquartered in Eugene, Summit Bank serves businesses and professionals in Eugene, Springfield, and Central Oregon communities. For more information, visit sbko.bank. It is our expectation to have these taped conversations available by Fridays at noon. We want to thank you all for supporting us during these difficult times. Before we thank our speakers today, there are a few quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, and Dot Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. And thank you to Community Television of Lane County, Cable Channel 29, for televising recent City Club programs. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. Next week, we talk about the rewriting of the history of Oregon. We ask the questions in writing Oregon's history: what was included and what was left out? We need to consider what happened when white settlers encountered Oregon's indigenous peoples in the 1800s, and what that means for our Northwest today. You may send questions for upcoming programs to the City Club's Executive Director. The program's moderator will select those questions to be asked for each program. Send your questions to administrator@cityclubofueugene.org. Please join us again on next Friday. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website, cityclubofueugene.org. Now, I'd like to thank today's speakers for a great program. Thank you to Karin Knudsen for moderating, and to Joe Mall, Gordon Grant, and Jared Pruch. Very informative program. Thank you so much. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.